The origin story is being out in the middle of the desert and a really strong matriarch of the community saying, "This is what we want for our children. Can you listen to us?" And it's been matriarchs throughout saying, "This is what we want. I just want the next generation of Yankunytjatjara poets. Why are they always English poets? And I want our children to be the next writers, but not writers only in English, but in language." There was a phrase here in Australia: we want the children to be able to walk the red dirt and the red carpet. So to be able to coexist in both worlds. So technology can't create change, only people can. These aren't our projects. This is the community. They own all the assets. They govern all the assets. We have a platform that we invest all our resources in. We want to make it better and better. But the end, I guess, owner, manager, governor of these spaces are the communities themselves. When children become curious about how sounds and patterns work in their own language, they draw conclusions about other languages. You don't have to be the unicorn. Sometimes being a zebra is as impactful.
So without further ado, can you tell me the founding story? How did it happen? Who made it happen? Who was involved? And what was the drive and push to actually start?
It's going to be a long founding story.
Very good.
Because the Living First Language platform, at the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, we've been working with Indigenous languages since 2004. And I'll tell you the founding and origin story well before digital. So all the early work was pen and paper. And in those early days in remote Australia, the message that we were hearing loud and clear from elders was, we want our children to become clever in our own language and in English. We want children to be able to read and write. There was a phrase here in Australia: we want the children to be able to walk the red dirt and the red carpet. So to be able to coexist in both worlds. And so that one of the key elders, Mrs. Nixon Nakkamarra of the Warumungu clan, sat our founder, Mary Ruth, and myself, been with the organization since that time, down and said, what I really want is for our children to be able to read and write, speak and listen in Warumungu. And that set off us on a journey, because before that had not had any plans to work in Indigenous language, and then it became part of the DNA of the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation. We worked in areas like Palm Island in remote Queensland, off the top end of Australia, and Groote Island in the central desert of Australia. Throw a dart in the middle of it and you find APY lands. And in each of that, just their journey, it was like making sure that there was education that was culturally relevant to the community, and that allowed the community, that the schools that were teaching in these communities to reflect the language and culture of the places children were learning. And the Living First Language platform evolved out of dipping our toe into technology. We developed, like people were doing in the 2011s and 2012s, we developed an iPad app for letters and sounds in the Alindili language. We developed an iPad app for children's dictionary, and we're very proud of that. But then we ran into this issue of the community wanted to add a few more words, and we said, okay, we'll go up, we'll record more words, we'll come back, we'll compile those words, and then we'll put them on the App Store. And so you're having this 4-week, 5-week, 6-week lag time between the community saying, we want to add more for our children, and that occurring. And so there's this middle person called the developer that needed to be involved. And so that set us on the mission to say, how can we create a really lightweight, accessible platform that no matter where you are in Australia, whether your language has thousands of speakers or only has 6 speakers, you could have the tools to curate learning resources in your language. And that also was that learning experience from the iPad app, as many community members said, I don't have an Android phone, or I don't have a tablet. Can I have? And it's no. So we said, we need to make sure that whatever we produce was device-agnostic. It didn't matter if you had a phone, a tablet, or a computer. And we also had that mobile-first strategy, which is smartphones were becoming ubiquitous, but not every household would have a laptop. And so we wanted to make sure that something like your phone became like a mobile language lab. You could record to it, you can read in it, you can take photos, and I guess that starts the founding story. So in that 2012, 2013, 14 period, we built our first prototype, the same sort of iPad app type structures, but they were editable. And I never want to touch that prototype again because it's like any prototype. It was as buggy as can be, but it taught us that there was a real need. And at that point, we were fortunate enough to be selected as a Google Impact Challenge finalist for Australia. And that attracted the seed funding that allowed us to set the foundations for the Living First Language platform. And so the rest is history, because since that seed funding, the platform's been used now across 17 Indigenous languages, and then next year that will be 20 Indigenous languages, or at least 20. It's sort of earmarked for 22. And it also is that story of scalability. Now it takes 5 minutes to load up a new language space, and that's that real software as a service model of, these aren't our projects. This is the community. They own all the assets. They govern all the assets. We have a platform that we invest all our resources in. We want to make it better and better. But the end, I guess, owner, manager, governor of these spaces are the communities themselves. So that's the origin. The origin story is being out in the middle of the desert and a really strong matriarch of the community saying, this is what we want for our children. Can you listen to us? And it's been matriarchs throughout saying, this is what we want. No, those iPad apps are enough. We want the changes right away. And each step it's been, okay, we want a platform that also allows us to share languages across geographic areas. One part of the origin story is developing a tool in the Torres Strait Islands at the top end of Australia, and people across various islands. So people on one island being able to create magical resources that people in surrounding islands can all benefit from, or in the middle of the central desert, some language sort of center right in this little small spot, providing resources for 142,000 square kilometers. So it's like, how do we bridge geographic distance? How do we get language out? Particularly in places in which there might be only 6 fluent speakers, how do we capture and collect the voices of the elders? So the next generation, there's more speakers than now, and the next generation after that. So that's a bit of the origin story.
And if we're going back to that origin story, what were you and your co-founder doing before? Like, why did that meeting clicked with you that you actually went out and started doing something about it?
Two things. One, my co-founder, I was working for my co-founder in a speech pathology practice, and we were called to support in a literacy project out in the Central Desert. And I think what was the gravitating force there was Mrs. Nixon really saw that the speech pathologist got it, that she understood that you need to understand the uniqueness of the sounds in the language to be able to not just pronounce it English way, but to pronounce it rightly and correctly. And so within the platform, I think the legacy of that platform is that there's the ability to store video recordings of how the sounds are made, where the tongue is, and not just like a dictionary comparing it to English. We don't want to do it a close approximation that this sound is like the English it in pin. No, we want to make sure it's just the sound and language. And I think that origin story is a meeting of minds, someone coming out with that speech pathology background and saying, I hear you. I hear that why you're frustrated that currently it's hard to teach the Warumungu literacy because people are not listening closely and not paying attention to just how authentic that language is. And that sort of created that partnership of, okay, we can use our skills to help magnify with Australia's oldest teachers. And so, yeah, we weren't, it wasn't like we were seeking out an opportunity to work with Indigenous languages. It was a quite organic meeting of the minds. And then since then, it's being able to, but I think that experience taught us the importance of developing trust and relationships, that we're not just developing we had that experience before we're a technology sort of
Mm,
company. Is we understand that just building the technology isn't going to impact or use. You have to build the governance and the trust and the ecosystem that goes with what do we all want to achieve through it.
yeah. And what was the first meeting about? Was it specifically about language pathology, or did it come about just as a side note in a context?
It was about literacy. So we were visiting this place called Tennant Creek, 5 hours north of Alice Springs. Again, throw a dart in the middle, Australia, there where you are. And I think we were brought in to bring together a literacy program. It was in its infancy, but because we had no vested interest of what the previous program is, we just listened. And through listening, we thought, okay, so like we know that maybe the project was meant to go in one direction about English literacy, but we're thinking the best pathway towards English literacy is mutual respect. And so that means engaging with and becoming vulnerable to the cultural preeminence of the Warumungu community, and then starting from there. So yeah, that it was coming in with a vision of literacy, but knowing that there's different pathways towards that. And I think that's been the story of different places is in Australia, not to get political, there is a bit of a history of English literacy. Don't do any language because these children are to catch up. But what we find is where that ethos is in place, children and families don't have that same trust with the school. It's please respect where we come from, and please respect the land and the language upon which this school and this education sits. And we're happy to engage in English and grow, but first, please allow our children to grow strong in our culture and our language.
Oh.
And languages in Australia is so connected to country. So it's to teach language off country is quite foreign or odd to communities. So they have to come back to country to teach language because it's meaningful in context. So we found that moving to other places, it's not just about literacy, it's about engagement in education.
Okay. And did you notice over these years that actually bringing the indigenous languages and respecting that culture actually also impacted English literacy? Or you abandoned the English literacy part and that's not of your concern?
I think what we found is, and I had a conversation about this today, is I've experienced that when children become curious about how sounds and patterns work in their own language, they draw conclusions about other languages. So and even in the early days, children would go, "Oh, the TJ is in our language Pittenjar. Oh, CH in English is also and just seeing children and meta language occurring, and we know that from international research that children who learn more than one language in the early years, it benefits them cognitively. That's a lot of that research has been done in major languages, so English, Spanish environments, English or French environments. But I think there's something to say about trying to extend that research into other contexts. But what I was talking about to someone, Australia has just launched a Australian network of quality ed tech, and we're a member of that. And we were having a conversation today about, and I'll throw in another sort of segue and then jump into it. It's how much time it takes for these projects to mature in order to have impact. And Sachi taught me that you don't have to be the unicorn. Sometimes being a zebra is as impactful. And we're at this point with some of our language projects that we're 5 years in, 6 years in, that we're seeing that we've gone through the phase of governance and trust in which communities are looking at these digital platforms, and they've got their management structure, and all the people that need to be on the project are there. And then this next phase is curating and collecting and making decisions upon what's best for teaching and learning. And in 3 projects specifically in Australia, we've well and truly moved into the 3rd phase, which is educational impact. And so that's where I'm getting to that question is, yes, we are starting to see not just impact on language literacy, but also English literacy by children being able to explore really closely how literacy and learning works in their own language. So one example is up in the Torres Strait in a language called Eru. Our language teacher there won a national award called the NAIDOC Award for caring for country and culture. And part of that has been her ongoing commitment to curating this digital space with the it's now 4 remaining speakers of that language.
Oh,
But it's evolved now that she's the language teacher in the school, and the children this year, their results in language and culture and literacy, but also there's results in literacy in general, were far stronger on her island than elsewhere in the Torres Strait. And so the Department of Education was starting to ask questions. But that partnership also involved a further partnership because we had the platform, but we partnered with Curious Learning in Boston, and who work with a open source UNICEF public digital goods tool called Feed the Monster, a video game for early literacy. And we were using our APIs to connect the platform to other learning tools. And so she was using that too. And that was only possible because there was that trust of what this digital project would be. And then once that trust was established, there was that really intensive curating over 3,900, I think are now just peaking over 4,000 words and 70 stories, and that sort of in this beautiful digital space. And then creating other tools with it, video games and the like. And now that being recognized
yeah.
and used within schools. And the same thing is happening in Tennant Creek. So the story of impact, or the story of founding towards impact, is these projects take time to mature, but that's the design of the platform, is give community time to understand how digital can play a role in something that's so human
Mm.
and so relational, and then set up those structures where youth and elders can work together to build this beautiful digital space, and then reconvene to say, now that we've built this beautiful digital space, how do we want it to impact teaching and learning? How do we want the next generation to have more language speakers? And one of our elders say, "Oh, I just want the next generation of Yankunytjatjara poets. Why are they always English poets? And I want our children to be in the next writers, but not writers only in English, but in language." Long story short, yes, we are starting to see that impact into just general education. And I think it comes from curiosity. Oh, I'm starting to see these patterns within this language that I'm really connected to. And I can see I'm like a little mini discoverer or scientist. I know I'm seeing these patterns in this language of English.
Wow, that's really like amazing story. And there are so many good points to, for me to connect on to. But first, how big is the community? Like, how big is the user base? Because of course I understand that the need, the want is born within the matriarch of the community who actually wants to pass on the language. But then what about the other side? What about the demand? What about the children and the people who are using it? Can you tell a bit more about that side?
It's quite diverse because it ranges from languages that we would say are revitalizing languages. So there might be only 350 members of the community who identify with that language. They wouldn't be all speakers, but they would identify, and that would be so across the 17 languages, you're looking at population sizes that would range from your 80 to 100 speakers to 15,000, 20,000 in the APY lands. It'd be interesting for me to do the maths, but and I guess that's the scope. And that's also why I've had conversations with big tech like AWS and Google, and they're not numbers that would attract big tech to invest time into. And I think that's why we feel it's so important it's even this, particularly in the smaller communities, for them to have tools that are custom built for them would be well beyond their budget to build themselves. But we're by building a platform. And and that was also the ethos of the founding story. So our chairman, and I should weave him into it, is Professor Tom Kama. So in that journey, we gained the attention of Professor Tom Coma, and he at that time was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Australia, and an Indigenous man himself. And he set us on the journey when we were doing the little apps in Ellendiliac. We're going, we need to have a platform that isn't only accessible to the big languages, because the big languages will find funding. We need to have a platform that is as quickly adoptable by your smaller groups as your bigger groups. And one of our power users is a little island as far north as you can get. You can see Papua New Guinea from it. You go, and they have a treaty with Papua New Guinea that you can enter Papua New Guinea without a passport if you're in that Torres Strait Islander, because there's so much family connection. And he said, I want it to be as equally available to that community who, in the face of colonization, is reclaiming something that's really core to their identity. So that's a more, I guess, grand answer to your question, but the user base is geographically large, but it wouldn't be in your millions, it would be in your thousands, but we're very proud of that as well.
Absolutely. As you said, because it takes real dedication to build something for smaller communities, really, that not so many people want to do, actually. So it's like super amazing, really.
And one tool we built for a language of Warumungu, who on the census has 350 language speakers, has been downloaded over 950 times. And so that community is excited because it's like, we've got more people exploring our language than ever. And we want people to be curious about our culture, our language. That makes us proud that we matter. And I guess that relates to the World Summit Awards, because we didn't win in the category of education. We won in culture and tourism. And that was because when we built our platform, we wanted to make sure that there was good APIs that if community wanted to innovate upon it, they could. And so our community in Western Australia called the Bunaba community, they built a cultural tourism website and allowed that community to surface all the recordings that they had done in their language space, and a website that was not community facing, but facing people visiting their country.
Yeah.
And they wanted those people, and it's a beautiful country, and they wanted to make sure that those people who visit the country, who usually just see beautiful sights, actually engaged with the history and the language and the culture, that there was something deeper in the places than they were visiting than a beautiful gorge. And I think that's also the story to tell is, yes, it's a great educational resource, but we want to be able to empower those communities who do want to share it beyond community with the tools to share what they're comfortable sharing. So sharing within that set of permissions, and through that, helping reconciliation.
Yeah. And have you seen, because I think across the world, at least like in Europe or the US, there's a lot of move to the roots, to back to the origins, like more handcrafted things being sold. Like I think that with all this technology and all this digital aspect, people are coming back to even Lithuania. We used to have Baltic pagan gods before Christianity took over. And there is so much movement towards, what about those? Let's look back at who we were before something global took over us. Have you seen a shift in the way the communities themselves, or maybe even outside of the communities, how they perceive the First Living Language platform, or like the user perception, or just in general, any observations in that aspect? Because you've been around for 12 years, so the world has changed drastically in that time, right?
It's changed. I have to admit that I guess one thing that I have seen, not shipped broadly, but I'll get to the answer. About a year and a half ago, during COVID, there was the Dubai Expo in 2021. It was meant to be 2020. And we were on a panel presenting at the Rewired Education Summit. And the panel presentation is what Indigenous knowledges teach us about sustainability in the world. And we were very proud to be part of that presentation, because in this world of climate change, and particularly in remote Indigenous communities, is that caring for country, that caring, preventing bushfires, that allowing for flood, and allowing for the land to be flooded and for that to recede was direly needed, because Australia had experienced both ghastly bushfires and then followed by ghastly sort of floods, and there wasn't that respect for how country seeks to heal itself. But the reason I'm hesitating on whether I've seen a shift in broader culture is, I don't know if you saw in the news, Australia had a vote this year upon whether we recognized the Indigenous voice as part of the founding document in Australia as far as the constitution. And the Australian public voted no, that they didn't want to recognize the Indigenous voice. And I'd say there's a lot that needs to happen to truly recognize the profound connect. I guess that is, in some ways, I don't want to sound positive, but I think it drives us to surface language, but also stories of sustainability on country, because there's a lack of recognition of traditional knowledges in contrast to Western knowledges, and Western knowledges are probably not going to be our best stories of sustainability in the next generation, particularly in contexts like the Torres Strait Islands, who as rising sea levels occur, their very livelihood will be impacted. So if we can make people curious about the cultural diversity of languages across the desert to the seas to regional areas, and make people curious about the knowledges that came before, we would be very proud of that. And there's a lot more work that needs to happen there. But you're right on one impactful moment that we need to grab hold of is we're, I think, less than 2 years into the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And as a global community, there'll be opportunities, there'll be funding, there'll be sort of avenues globally to try to connect that story between language, culture, and history.
Absolutely. And do you know why Australia voted no? Is it because of the lack of interest? Is it because there is some, in general, kind of like separation and division between the new Australians and the old Australians, if you wish?
Yeah, definitely. I think to put it in context, it's an interesting referendum, and I'm coming across oddly because I have an American accent, but it's an interesting referendum to have, because 5% Indigenous Australians represent 5% of the country, but you have 95% of the country voting in those interests. And I feel that on a daily basis, there's a general awareness of Indigenous culture in Australia, but not a personal, deeply connected awareness. So I think it was driven a little bit, is it necessary? Do we really need this? Do we really want to make a change that is so fundamental? And for the people who are voting, that question of is it necessary wasn't personal, wasn't deeply emotional, which is sad, because it meant that the people who were voting mostly yes, meaning those Indigenous communities, felt that the rest of the population said that you don't need, this isn't necessary. It wasn't, I read it in that way rather than a violent or vehement reaction against the Indigenous community, but more of a let's, almost the word status quo. Let's be careful. Let's not make an abrupt change. And that's, there's going to be a need of recognizing history at some point. And also within the work that we do is making people curious about the linguistic diversity. It's like there's 239 languages that were spoken in Australia, and of those 139 are still spoken, but only 13 are considered strong. But that's still a massive diversity. And there's Malaysian words and the trade, how the trade impacted the connections between culture and Afghani history within a central desert. It's all really enriching. And that's just only looking at the Living First Language platform as something in Australia, because we've been having those conversations with the US and Canada about growth and how, how that technology can be applicable in other
Yeah,
places.
absolutely. Like what I'm especially interested in the book is obviously the kind of human aspects, the context, because it's a book about the whole world, the context of the local context that it needs changing or adapting or improvement, because that's why you started doing what you're doing. So that's why when I'm asking questions, I'm actually stressing on those aspects that are more kind of subtle, that people don't necessarily, who are not Australians, who don't necessarily know about it just naturally. So that's why some of my questions might feel odd, because you might be more inclined to talk about the business, but actually this book is not about the business. It's more about actually the human condition in the local context and how it's changing because of what you're doing and all of that human aspects. So yeah, if you don't mind.
I guess if I paint, I was going to paint a really strong picture of the local sort of story, and then sorry to interrupt, but I'll paint it quickly, and then you can. Is what's core to every language that we work with is that there is, I guess, an intergenerational connection. Is each project has a local language facilitator, one or two, maybe more. Often as a young person, a digital native, they're not fluent in language, but they got a concept of how this technology works, and they've got a passion around language. And around them are language mentors, so elders who sit around them and then guide them and direct them. And then around them, there's a language advisory group, which is also like a committee of key elders. And I think what's each of that project of, from a local condition is, if you imagine around Australia is, so the platform is seen as, this is your asset.
Yeah.
This is your sort of something, a tool, your repository. But it's just technology. Technology can't create change. Only people can. So creating that ecosystem around the technology and that discovery, we've been part of workshops in which this a language space will be plateauing at about 2,000, 3,000 words. And then some elders start talking and they'll remember a word. And they're like, I haven't heard that word for 50 years. It was when I was a child, and my man, and that just become, and there might be only 3 words added that week, but those 3 words generated days of conversation. And I think that's the story of the platform, is how I've seen over my history of time, every year people revisit the same thing, and that paper-based resource goes missing, and then next year going, oh, what do we want to do this year? And it's the same topic, but having this digital repository, it's like you build this year, and then next year you can build more on top of it, and the next year you build more on top of it. So it becomes our biggest goal within each of those projects is to get that sense of ownership, that this is ours. And that's the local stories is that, and then as it becomes theirs, stories get told, it gets shared to different homes, and people get curious about it. And yeah, and suddenly on the, in one of our communities, on the little town supermarket wall, they're like, this week we're not saying thank you anymore, we're saying,
Oh,
and then so what's the word of the week that we're going to start weaving in, so that you no longer, we can learn the day-to-day language and be connected to our heritage.
so did you see that also this tool has started bringing together the community? Does it work that people would actually gather together and they would discuss and they would turn it into a community meeting as well? Or is it like varies per different language and different community?
It's different in different communities. One thing was very special. I keep on talking about the Torres Strait one because it's been one of our longest sort of languages, but in education, it's quite commonly the case that in the past, resources were developed by schools, and then that meant the school owned them, and the communities, this isn't ours. What's been lovely within, I guess not only that language, but like Pitnjar and a couple other languages, is the resource that's developed as recordings of 30 or 40 different people. And so when children are playing the game, they're not only just playing a game, but they're like, oh, that's auntie. Oh, that's grandma. And that's uncle. And then people get, and they take that home. And so they play it at school, but then they want to take it home to show their relatives, and the relatives hear the connections of voices, or it's used in the school, but then it's used also at the adult literacy center on the island at the IKC, and then people slowly over time who don't want to do a recording 3 years down the track going, oh, everyone else has done it. I'll give it a go. I'll do some recordings this week. So it is a little bit like crowdsourcing of language
Yeah.
is, as it becomes surfaced as it become, usually it starts off as being curated by a backbone core team. And then as the word gets out, more people want to get involved and more people want to get involved. And because the first question I ask is, I'm only going to get involved in who owns this? And if you say you do as the community, okay, I'll be involved. And usually at conferences, when some of our language communities present, we say, you can present. You're not presenting our project, you're presenting your project. The first thing people ask is, oh, so what are people going to do with your data? They'll say, it's our data. No one can do anything with our data. So it does become a community thing, and we've had lovely projects in which in the morning there's 3 or 4 people recording, and by the end of the day there's 30 people in the room because word gets out going, oh, do you want to come and check the ranger office? We're doing, they're doing something. And that the richest language bases that we have it is when you hear all the young voices and older voices, and there's a child's voice, and it is there's a musicality to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell me a little bit about the life of Indigenous communities within Australia? So from what I'm hearing, it varies so greatly in terms of a distance. But let's say first aspect is like, are there any connection between different Indigenous communities? And what about the connection to the whole Australia, to the 95% of the Australians? Or are the communities growing, or are people actually leaving from those desert areas into the cities to blend in? Like, what is the kind of socioeconomic, demographic situation in the Indigenous communities?
It's an interesting question. There's definitely, we tend to do a lot of our work in the most remote parts of Australia. I never take for granted that there's parts of Australia that I've seen that everyday person has not ever touched foot on. And with that comes both, I think that communities that always express two things to me. With it comes lack of access to services due to being so remote, but also that that connection to a lifestyle and a country that's so deeply important. So whilst there's historically been sometimes nudges and pressures from certain politicians for remote communities to move into urban areas, I don't see that as much as I don't see that as a big movement at the moment. But socioeconomically, lots of our communities that we work with have significant challenges with access to affordable food and power, access to jobs and employment. So one of the key factors around the language projects is connecting young people to country and to culture and to identity, because those are protective factors against things like crime and substance abuse, or I shouldn't say common, but a part of lived experience within remote communities. Yeah, some of the language elders that we work with have big visions that we've lost language, we've lost culture, and that's had an impact on that sense of identity, a personal identity, sense of community identity, connection to who we are as people. And so some of the language projects are forward thinking, that we need to reconnect all generations to language and culture, because in some ways an economic rationalist approach of just learn the English way and English jobs, and that's going to prepare you, it hasn't paid the dividends that elders would prefer, or elders have the wisdom that they have, which is, if you're strong in the sense of who you are and where you come from, and you have a strong connection to your land and your country, there are roles for you. So I know that's a sort of a Morpheus sort of answer, but I think that the 95% of the country would probably think, all those people, they'd want to move to an urban area where there's jobs, and what they don't recognize is that's home, that's homeland, that's country, that's our history. We want to stay on country. We want to have the opportunity for that old thing the phrase I started the conversation with. We want to walk the red dirt and the red carpet. We want to be equally strong. And that is one of the pressures on young people, is leaving community to gain an education, and then gaining an education and saying, well, I could get a job in the urban area where I get my education, or I can bring those skills back and apply to the sort of community. And it is an aspect of the work we do, is by encouraging language facilitators and the language workers, we're also trying to create jobs around language and technology, so that those involved in the project have a skill set that is seen as of value, and then offering that's enhancing teaching and learning and cultural awareness.
Do you have any developers?
As far as developers, we on our team we collaborate with a few developers. The most important sort of thing that we stress is, across the 17 languages, we've got this amazing network of language workers. So on the non-technical side, it's just been amazing to watch young champions grow. But there's some technological sort of, there's some amazing individuals in the technology space in Australia that we sort of network with, and we collaborate with, like Michaela Jade and some of the Indigenous mapping sort of crew. They're not on my digital development team themselves, but if I had my way, I would bring them in. So it's one of our ambitions, is to be able to, we've offered internships to up and coming Indigenous developers. That's been lovely to watch, and lovely but bittersweet for others to snap them up. But yeah, we have gotten a few government grants because of that. Yes, the government wants to invest in language and culture, but they also want to see really quality jobs that are valued by the community. And so those language facilitators and the language workers and the archivists that we support in community, and to see that, and we've seen a few join national committees. Or I mentioned one, that national ward, who's then gone on to be a regional sort of mentor. So it's in that language workspace. We've again lost a few because they've gone from being a language worker to, wait, a university has just snapped them up, but you just sort of, this is amazing.
Yeah. I have two kind of maybe final questions given the time. One is, what are your biggest challenges? And another one is, what are you most excited about for the future? Starting with less positive, but still challenges, so something hopefully that can be overcome. And then what are you excited about the future too?
Our biggest challenge is meeting demand. So in Australia has this thing called Poloma, which is the Indigenous Language and Technology Conference that brings together community members from far afield. It's like one of those unique conferences that people aren't flying in from urban areas. They're flying in from every single corner. And the interest that we received from the network, it was around 30 to 35 other languages that said we'd love the platform. And I think our biggest barrier at the moment is being able to quickly meet the demand and quickly onboard sort of communities. And twofold with that is just really economies of scale, pushing to get our licensing to the model more affordable, more accessible, and also building up a network of sponsors so that when a community says, we really want to get started, you don't have to wait for a grant or for support to come together, that we can hit the ground running. And that goes hand in hand, having the investment to have stronger but still community sensitive onboarding tools that allows communities to get started in the lightest touch sort of manner. So I know that sounds like a technology barrier, but
it's a funding barrier.
People call up going, can we start up? And it's a funding barrier, and it's a human resourcing barrier, but it's a nice barrier to have, because rather than going, we don't have anybody interested, that's a barrier. It's more like, we've got too many people interested, and how do we vet and grow responsibly?
That makes you very creative.
And wonder and learn.
Yeah, that makes you creative and really just finding ways. But just to clarify, so right now you mostly work off the grants, your funding wise?
It's a combination of yes, grants, but also local sponsors. So that's why I'm really keen to drive down the licensing costs so that the community themselves could crowdsource the basic resources they need to get started. So you don't have to be grant reliant. That they'd be like, let's get a little bit of money from the butcher and, and the supermarket and the local industry, and that's something we'd really want to move towards. Is that we can just get a collective surge, that you're not reliant upon grants going to a grant committee, and then similar to that is reaching out. We're a longstanding not-for-profit, so Australian Literacy Numeracy Foundation, with hybrid social enterprise, meaning the Living First Language platform company on the side, is to use our network of the ALNF to build up a trust, or to build up a corpus fund that we could have a governing committee to draw down and say, we've got a new community that wants to get on board. They've done an expression of interest. So just finding the best mechanism that we can respond. I guess the other barrier, we've got 1,001 ideas, video gaming on the platform, geolocating. We've already built an offline Raspberry Pi tool so that it can exist out in the middle of nowhere. I've got a development roadmap that probably would cost me $10 million. So finding investors to just allow silly ideas to keep going. So that's not necessarily a barrier, but it's that's I guess the next question is visions. I mean, we just would love to continue growing organically within Australia and just watch and see every language that takes it up. We learn upon how it fits. We'd love opportunity. Our other aspirations to have at least one or two or three international opportunities. We want to invest into white labeling so that it can look and feel culturally relevant. At the moment, we're talking to groups in US and Canada, but also in Belfast, so within the UK, and that's linked to just being part of that global network. And over time, I've talked less and less about our ambitions being AI and AR, and it's like, no, that others go in that direction. We would rather, our mission is to see more and more users and to see children grow and to see communities in which language is decreasing generation after generation, to see communities in which the next generation there's more speakers than the previous generation and more awareness of language. So that's a curiosity.
Nice. And really, final question: if you had a magic wand and you can ask for anything, then bringing languages, or I don't know, adaptation, or even like anything related to Indigenous languages, what would that be? It's a tricky one, I know.
It's a tricky one because some people would jump and say AI that would understand any Indigenous language, and I hesitate from that because languages are human. Just because AI understands it doesn't mean it's being passed from one generation, one person to the next. And we use this term in language learning called dosage. So my magic wand is that children have heaps of dosage on learnings or language that they can go from in a classroom, person to person, go in a language camp, but then also have little moments of micro games on the platform to reinforce that knowledge, so that just that fluidity is wherever they go. And that might be technology like AR, being able to walk into an environment and go, I forget what the word for tree is, and this go through a viewfinder and go, oh, now I remember. So just being immersed in language, but it complementing the human, and allowing opportunities for people to have physical face-to-face. Sometimes we use the term language parties, language camps with others. But then to have further opportunities as they're exploring the day-to-day, to just being able to absorb language. And maybe AR is my next sort of technological vision, is being able to see it everywhere you are.
That's a very beautiful wish for enhancing human experience through technology. Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure, and I'm really excited about writing about your story.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And with that, I want to invite you to listen closely to the voices of the land you walk on, to the stories and the languages that have shaped communities for generations. Eric Brace's journey with the first living language platform shows us how technology then guided by respect and collaboration, can breathe life into Indigenous cultures, connecting elders to youth and deserts to islands. I encourage you to reflect on how you can honor the heritage around you, whether by learning a word, sharing a story, or supporting efforts to preserve linguistic diversity, because we all have heritage in our local countries. Share this episode with those who care about culture and connection, and if you're interested to amplify Indigenous voices, visit the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation's website to explore how we can support their mission to keep these languages thriving. On that note, next week, I will be bringing you another story from the Edge of Impact, this time from Natural History Museum of London, which is also trying to preserve the world's heritage in a very different manner. See you next week at the Edge of Impact.